I didn't realize how much weight a single moment could carry until I felt it settle into my chest, heavy and irreversible, the instant the dressing room door stopped being a barrier and became a threshold. I was 26 years old enough to know better and still young enough to believe I could keep parts of myself neatly separated, like items on a receipt no one else would ever read closely. I had driven myself to the mall that afternoon with the same practical excuses I'd been rehearsing for years. I needed socks, I needed a jacket, I needed to kill time before dinner, but the truth had been riding quietly beside me the entire drive, patient and familiar. I wanted to try something on. Not to be seen. Not to be admired. Just to feel, for a moment, what it was like to stand inside a version of myself that had only existed in imagination and reflection. The store was brighter than I remembered, or maybe I was more aware of light than usual. Everything felt slightly overexposed, as if the world had turned its contrast up without warning. I moved carefully, deliberately, aware of my body in a way I usually wasn't, how my shoulders squared when I walked, how my voice would sound if someone spoke to me, how easily attention could find me if I wasn't careful. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I had done this before in other places, other cities, where anonymity softened the edges of fear. Still, my pulse refused to settle. I chose the clothes slowly, touching fabrics I had learned to pretend not to notice in public. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would read as performance. Just pieces that felt gentle. Thoughtful. I remember thinking that if someone else saw these items draped over my arm, they might assume they were for a partner, or a gift, or a sister. That assumption felt like a small mercy, even as it reminded me how much I relied on other people's expectations to shield me from myself. The dressing room attendant barely looked up when she handed me the key. That anonymity felt like a blessing then. I didn't know yet how temporary it would be. Inside the stall, the air felt different, quieter, insulated from the noise of the store. I locked the door and stood still for a long moment, listening to my own breathing. This was always the hardest part, not the clothes, not the mirror, but the pause before choice became action. I thought about how many times I had reached this point in my life and turned back, folding curiosity into shame, telling myself I was being indulgent or confused or ungrateful for the body and role I'd been given. I thought about how often I had promised myself I would figure it out later, as if identity were a task that could be postponed indefinitely without cost. When I finally changed, I did it slowly, almost ceremonially, as if rushing might cheapen something I didn't fully understand yet. The mirror didn't show me a different person so much as a quieter one. Someone less armored. Someone whose posture softened without instruction. I wasn't trying to pass. I wasn't trying to transform in any external, dramatic sense. What unsettled me was how internal the shift felt, how quickly my thoughts rearranged themselves around this new alignment, like furniture moved into a room that had always been waiting for it. I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, that this wasn't about clothes at all. It was about permission. That was when I heard my name. Not called sharply, not shouted, but spoken with the familiar cadence that had shaped my childhood, my mother's voice, warm and inquisitive, carrying just enough concern to suggest she'd been looking for me longer than expected. My first reaction wasn't panic. It was disbelief. The kind that makes your body go numb before your mind catches up. I stared at the door as if it might answer for me, as if the thin wood and metal could somehow negotiate on my behalf. I checked the lock even though I knew it was engaged. I considered, absurdly, staying silent until she gave up. Then she said my name again, closer this time. In that narrowing space between sound and consequence, I felt something settle inside me that I hadn't anticipated, not fear of being seen, but exhaustion from hiding. It was the sudden understanding that no matter what I did next, something was going to change, and that the change itself was not the true danger. The danger was continuing to live as if moments like this didn't matter. I opened the door. The look on her face wasn't shock. That's the detail people always expect when I tell this story, and it's the one that never fits. It was recognition, slow, searching, layered with confusion and something else I couldn't name yet. We stood there, two adults bound by decades of shared history, both realizing at the same time that we were standing at the edge of a conversation we had never learned how to have. No one else noticed us. The world, mercifully or cruelly, kept moving. I remember thinking, in that suspended second, that this was not the moment I had feared all my life. This was the moment after, the one where fear stopped being abstract and started demanding honesty. And I wasn't sure yet whether I was ready to answer. She didn't step back when the door opened. That's what I remember most clearly. She didn't recoil, didn't scan the hallway in embarrassment, didn't lower her voice into secrecy. She simply looked at me the way she always had when she sensed something was wrong but didn't yet know what questions to ask. That familiar steadiness made everything more fragile, not less. For a moment neither of us spoke. I was acutely aware of how exposed I felt, not because of what I was wearing, but because there was no longer a version of myself I could switch back to instantly. I couldn't straighten my shoulders and become unremarkable. I couldn't laugh it off without lying. The person standing there was still me, but the usual exits had closed. She broke the silence first, quietly, carefully, as if volume itself might decide the outcome. She asked if I was okay. Not why I was dressed the way I was. Not what I thought I was doing. Just whether I was okay. That question landed harder than any accusation could have. I realized I didn't know how to answer it honestly without opening doors I'd spent years reinforcing. I said something vague at first, yes, I was fine, I just needed a minute, but my voice betrayed me. It sounded thinner than I expected, unfamiliar in its softness. I noticed her listening not just to my words, but to the space around them. She suggested we sit somewhere. Not the food court, not the benches in the open mall, but the small seating area tucked behind the store, half hidden by a planter and a sale rack. It was the kind of place meant for waiting, not talking, which somehow made it perfect. Transitional spaces had always felt safer to me. As we walked, I became hyper-aware of movement, how fabric shifted when I took a step, how my center of gravity felt subtly different, how my hands no longer knew where to rest. I expected self-consciousness to spike, but instead something else happened. The internal noise I'd carried for so long quieted just enough for me to think clearly. I wasn't performing. I wasn't experimenting. I was simply existing, and the world, inconveniently and miraculously, was allowing it. She didn't ask me to change. That detail matters. She could have. It would have been reasonable. But she didn't. She sat beside me and folded her hands the way she always did when she was preparing to listen rather than speak. I told her I hadn't planned for her to see me like this. That was true, but incomplete. What I didn't say yet was that I had planned for no one to ever see me like this and was beginning to understand how unrealistic that plan had always been. She nodded, absorbing that without interruption, giving me the rare gift of time to catch up to my own thoughts. When she finally asked what this meant, I found myself resisting the urge to label it quickly. I had spent years collecting terminology privately, reading essays and studies and personal accounts, convincing myself that knowledge could substitute for vulnerability. But sitting there, I understood that labels would only shrink the truth if I used them defensively. So I spoke instead about feelings. About how long they had been there. About how they didn't arrive all at once, but accumulated slowly, like sediment, until ignoring them required more effort than acknowledging them. I told her that wearing different clothes wasn't the cause of those feelings, but a language for them. A way to listen to myself without interruption. I told her that I wasn't trying to deceive anyone, including her, but that I had been afraid of what honesty would cost. Saying that out loud felt like admitting a moral failing, not because secrecy is inherently wrong, but because mine had been motivated by fear rather than care. She asked whether I was unhappy. That question frightened me more than the previous ones because it implied responsibility. If I said yes, then something would have to change. If I said no, then I would be lying to protect stability at the expense of truth. I told her that I wasn't unhappy in the way people imagine, but that I was incomplete in a way that had begun to feel unsustainable. She didn't argue. She didn't reassure me prematurely. She asked what I needed. I didn't have an answer ready, which embarrassed me. I had spent so much time preparing explanations that I hadn't prepared requests. After a long pause, I said that I needed space to understand myself without shame, and that I needed patience, for myself most of all, but from the people I loved if possible. Saying, if possible, felt important. It acknowledged that others had limits too. We sat there longer than I realized. The mall noise faded into a kind of ambient hum. People passed without looking at us closely, absorbed in their own errands, their own internal negotiations. That anonymity, which had once felt like protection, now felt like permission to exist without spectacle. I thought about how many fears I had constructed around public perception, and how few of them accounted for the simple truth that most people are busy surviving their own lives. Eventually she spoke again, and her voice carried a careful honesty that I recognized from other difficult moments in our shared past. She told me she didn't fully understand, and that pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But she also told me that confusion was not rejection, and that love was not conditional on her immediate comprehension. She said she would need time, just as I had needed time, and that it would be unfair to expect either of us to arrive at clarity instantly. That balance, between acceptance and accountability, stayed with me. She wasn't asking me to retreat, but she wasn't absolving me of the responsibility to consider how my choices affected others. That felt right. Identity, I was beginning to learn, is not a solitary endeavor. It is relational, unfolding in dialogue with the people and contexts that shape us. When we finally stood to leave, she asked if I wanted to go home or stay out a bit longer. The choice surprised me. Going home would mean returning to familiar structures, familiar expectations. Staying out would mean continuing to occupy this uncertain space a little longer. I chose to stay out. Not because I felt brave, but because retreat suddenly felt more frightening than forward motion. We walked together through the mall, not speaking much, just recalibrating around each other. I noticed how often I scanned for her reactions, how deeply I wanted reassurance without asking for it. I also noticed something quieter and more unsettling. I was less preoccupied with how strangers saw me than with how I saw myself. The external risk had forced an internal reckoning, and I couldn't unfeel that shift. By the time we parted that afternoon, nothing had been resolved. There were no declarations, no neat conclusions. But something irreversible had happened. The version of myself who believed this could remain entirely private no longer existed. In his place was someone who understood that secrecy had been a shelter, not a home. And as I drove away alone, I felt the unfamiliar weight of accountability settle alongside relief. Not the kind that comes from being forgiven, but the kind that comes from being seen and still allowed to continue. Driving home alone felt different than I expected. I had imagined either relief so sharp it bordered on euphoria or dread so heavy it would hollow me out. Instead, what settled over me was something quieter and more complicated, a sense of exposure that didn't fade when no one was looking. It was as if the conversation hadn't ended when we parted, but had simply moved inward, continuing without words. I kept replaying small details from the afternoon, not what I'd said, but what I hadn't. The pauses I'd filled too quickly. The places where I'd softened the truth out of habit, even when honesty had already cracked the door open. I realized that secrecy doesn't disappear all at once, it resists extinction by disguising itself as politeness, as patience, as consideration. I told myself I was protecting others, but sitting alone with my thoughts, I had to confront how often I had been protecting my own comfort instead. At home, the apartment felt oddly neutral, like a place that no longer fully recognized me. I changed back into my usual clothes without ceremony, noticing how automatic the movements were, how familiar and strangely distant the mirror felt. It wasn't rejection I felt toward my reflection, but a growing awareness that this version of me was no longer the whole story. It was a role I knew how to play well, and that knowledge carried its own quiet grief. That evening I didn't distract myself the way I normally would. No background noise, no scrolling, no rehearsing future conversations in my head. I sat with the discomfort deliberately, trying to understand what had shifted. What unsettled me most wasn't that my mother had seen me differently, but that I had seen myself persist under her gaze. The world hadn't ended. I hadn't collapsed. I had spoken imperfectly but honestly. That evidence contradicted years of assumptions I had treated as fact. Over the following weeks, that contradiction began to ripple outward into other parts of my life. At work, I noticed how much energy I spent monitoring myself, my posture, my tone, my word choices, not because they were wrong, but because they were curated. I began to question the cost of that constant adjustment. It wasn't that I wanted to abandon professionalism or responsibility, but I started to see how easily self-erasure can masquerade as maturity. I thought often about accountability. About the fact that self-discovery doesn't happen in a vacuum, and that my choices intersected with other people's expectations, fears, and limits. It would have been tempting to frame my experience as purely internal, a personal journey that required nothing from anyone else. But that framing felt dishonest. My silence had shaped relationships just as much as my truth would. Owning that was uncomfortable, but necessary. I spoke with my mother again a few days later, this time over the phone. The distance made it easier to talk and harder to hide. She asked more questions, some clumsy, some incisive, all sincere. I answered what I could and admitted when I didn't know. There were moments of tension, especially when her concerns touched on safety, on public perception, on how the world treats people who don't fit neatly into expected categories. I couldn't dismiss those fears because they weren't imaginary. They were rooted in care, not control. What surprised me was how often our conversation returned to ethics rather than identity. She asked what honesty meant to me now. How I planned to navigate situations where my needs conflicted with others' comfort. Whether I saw this as something that excused past distance or demanded future responsibility. Those questions challenged me more than any interrogation about labels ever could have. They forced me to articulate values, not just feelings. I began to understand that self-acceptance is not a declaration but a practice. One that involves listening, revising, apologizing when necessary, and resisting the urge to frame oneself as either victim or hero. My story wasn't about being misunderstood by everyone else, it was also about how long I had misunderstood myself, and the ways that misunderstanding had shaped my behavior. As I allowed myself to exist more honestly in private, I also became more attentive to how others navigate visibility. I noticed small things I'd overlooked before, the way certain people scan a room before speaking, the care with which others choose their words, the relief that flickers when someone realizes they don't have to explain themselves in a given space. These observations didn't turn me outward in a performative way, they made me quieter, more patient, more willing to sit with ambiguity rather than rush to judgment. There were setbacks. Days when fear reclaimed its old authority and I convinced myself that nothing had really changed, that I could still compress myself back into something simpler. But even those moments felt different now. They carried the awareness that retreat was a choice, not an inevitability. That awareness came with responsibility. If I chose silence, I had to own its consequences rather than blame circumstance. I didn't tell friends right away. Not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted to understand my own boundaries before negotiating them with others. That restraint felt important. I had learned how easy it is to confuse disclosure with resolution, to assume that saying something out loud completes the work. In truth, it often just begins it. What anchored me during that time was a growing commitment to integrity. Not the rigid kind that demands purity or certainty, but the flexible kind that allows for growth without self-betrayal. I started asking myself, in small everyday decisions, whether I was acting out of fear or care. Whether I was choosing ease over honesty or balance over avoidance. Those questions didn't always have clean answers, but asking them changed how I moved through the world. Looking back now, I see that the afternoon in the mall wasn't a climax or a turning point in the dramatic sense. It was a disruption, an interruption of a narrative I had been telling myself about who I was allowed to be and under what conditions. That interruption didn't resolve anything on its own, but it made continued denial untenable. I was still learning. Still uncertain. Still aware of the risks ahead. But I was no longer pretending that my inner life was a private inconvenience. It had become something real enough to require ethical consideration, something worthy of patience and care. And that realization, more than any change in appearance or language, marked the beginning of a transformation I could no longer postpone. The first time I went out alone after that afternoon, I didn't intend for it to be a test. I told myself I was just running errands, that I would keep things simple, neutral, unremarkable. But intention has a way of dissolving once it meets reality. What I was really doing was measuring how much of myself I could carry into public without collapsing under the weight of self-consciousness. I learned quickly that fear doesn't always announce itself as panic. Sometimes it shows up as negotiation. I found myself bargaining internally, adjusting, recalibrating, asking what was strictly necessary and what could be deferred. The question wasn't, who am I, so much as, how much honesty can this moment hold? That distinction mattered. It reframed identity not as a fixed truth demanding expression at all costs, but as a responsibility to oneself that had to coexist with context. In public spaces, I noticed how much meaning we assign to glances that may not exist. A passerby looking in my direction became a potential judgment. A neutral expression felt loaded. It took effort to remind myself that perception is not intention, and that discomfort does not automatically signal danger. Still, my body reacted faster than my reasoning. My shoulders tightened. My breath shortened. Years of conditioning don't dissolve just because insight arrives. What surprised me was how quickly moments of fear were followed by moments of clarity. Standing in line, overhearing mundane conversations, watching people move through their lives with barely any awareness of mine, I realized how much of my anxiety had been built around imagined audiences. The world was not waiting to evaluate me. It was busy, distracted, imperfectly attentive. That realization didn't erase risk, but it shrank it to a scale I could engage with honestly. As weeks passed, I began to talk with my mother more openly, though not always easily. Our conversations were uneven. Some days felt like progress, others felt like we were circling the same uncertainties from different angles. I had to confront my own impatience. I wanted reassurance to arrive faster than understanding realistically could. Wanting that didn't make me wrong, but acting as if it were owed would have. She spoke about her fears more plainly over time, not as arguments, but as admissions. Fear that I would be hurt. Fear that I would be misunderstood. Fear that she would say the wrong thing and lose me. Hearing that last one reframed many of her earlier hesitations. What I had sometimes interpreted as resistance was, in part, a carefulness born of love and unfamiliarity. That didn't mean I softened everything for her comfort. There were moments when I had to assert boundaries, to clarify that some aspects of my experience were not open to debate or dismissal. Learning how to do that without defensiveness was one of the hardest skills I developed during that period. I was used to either hiding or justifying. Neither approach served me anymore. What I needed was steadiness. I began to notice how this internal work changed my interactions with others, even those who knew nothing about my situation. I listened more carefully. I interrupted less. I felt less urgency to define myself through contrast. When identity is fragile, it demands constant reinforcement. When it begins to stabilize, it allows for generosity. Eventually, I told a close friend. I chose them deliberately, not because I expected perfect understanding, but because they had a history of responding thoughtfully to complexity. I didn't frame it as a confession or an announcement. I framed it as context, something important about how I had been living internally, and how that internal life might begin to show itself differently. Their response was imperfect and sincere. They asked questions that revealed both curiosity and blind spots. I corrected gently where I could and named discomfort where it mattered. What stayed with me wasn't the content of their questions, but their willingness to sit with uncertainty rather than rush toward resolution. That willingness mirrored what I was learning to cultivate in myself. Not every response I received later carried that same care. Some people defaulted to simplification, eager to categorize me in ways that made sense to them. Others tried to be supportive but leaned too heavily on reassurance, as if affirming me required minimizing the difficulty of the path I was walking. I learned to recognize both as forms of misunderstanding, even when well-intentioned. Through all of this, I kept returning to a central ethical question: what does it mean to live truthfully without demanding that others immediately reorganize their world around that truth? I didn't want my honesty to become a blunt instrument. At the same time, I refused to keep shrinking myself to maintain an illusion of ease. The answer, I found, was ongoing negotiation, not compromise of self, but coordination with reality. It meant being clear without being coercive, open without being careless, patient without being passive. It meant accepting that growth, both mine and others, would be uneven and sometimes uncomfortable. There were moments when I grieved the simplicity of the life I had imagined for myself, the ease of moving through the world without this layer of consideration. But that grief was tempered by another realization: simplicity bought through self-denial is not peace. It is quiet, but it is not rest. By the end of that season, I no longer thought of myself as someone in transition, in the dramatic sense. I was simply someone practicing alignment, one decision at a time. The work wasn't glamorous. It was slow, often invisible, and deeply formative. And for the first time, I trusted that I could continue it without disappearing. By the time the initial intensity faded, I began to understand that the most difficult work wasn't disclosure or visibility, but continuity. It's one thing to confront a moment of truth, it's another to live in a way that honors it consistently, especially when novelty wears off and the world resumes its ordinary demands. I still had a job, bills, friendships, routines, structures that didn't pause to accommodate introspection. The challenge became figuring out how to carry this growing self-awareness into a life that hadn't been designed around it. I noticed how temptation shifted. Earlier, the urge had been to hide. Now, the temptation was to overcorrect, to define myself primarily through this lens, to let it eclipse other aspects of who I was. That impulse came from the same place as fear, the desire for certainty. I had to resist the idea that understanding myself required constant emphasis, constant proof. Identity, I was learning, doesn't need to be loud to be real. At work, I began making small, intentional changes, not in presentation, but in presence. I stopped laughing off comments that made me uncomfortable. I clarified boundaries instead of absorbing tension silently. These were changes no one could point to specifically, but they altered how I felt occupying shared spaces. I was less reactive, less brittle. That steadiness had ripple effects. People responded to me differently, not because they knew more about me, but because I was no longer fragmenting myself to manage their expectations. There were still moments of fear, especially when routines intersected with unpredictability. Social gatherings, extended family events, public situations where assumptions move faster than understanding. I became more deliberate about when and how I engaged. This wasn't avoidance, it was discernment. I began to accept that visibility is not an obligation, and privacy is not a failure. The difference lies in intention. Was I choosing discretion out of fear, or out of care for myself and others? That question became a compass. My relationship with my mother continued to evolve in uneven but meaningful ways. She made mistakes. So did I. There were moments when her concern slipped into protectiveness that felt constraining, and moments when my insistence on autonomy felt abrupt. What mattered was that we kept returning to conversation rather than retreating into assumption. Over time, we developed a shared language, not perfect, not complete, but functional. That, I realized, is often what love looks like in practice. One afternoon, months after the mall, she admitted that she had been quietly reevaluating parts of her own life, assumptions she had inherited without examining, fears she had accepted as inevitable. Hearing that unsettled me. I hadn't anticipated that my self-exploration would invite reflection in others, especially someone who had long been a fixed point in my understanding of the world. It reminded me that personal change is rarely contained. It travels outward, whether we intend it to or not. That realization deepened my sense of responsibility. Not guilt, but care. I became more attentive to how I spoke about my experience, resisting both defensiveness and evangelism. I didn't want my story to become a template or a test. It was simply one path among many, shaped by specific circumstances, relationships, and timing. Respecting that specificity felt ethically important. As I became more settled internally, I noticed how differently I interpreted misunderstanding. Where once I had braced for rejection, I now recognized confusion as a neutral starting point. Not everyone who falters is hostile, not everyone who asks questions is entitled to answers. Learning when to engage and when to disengage was an ongoing skill, one that required humility as much as confidence. There were setbacks that tested that balance. Casual comments that revealed assumptions I hadn't anticipated. Bureaucratic processes that demanded simplification where nuance was necessary. Moments when I felt reduced to an explanation rather than encountered as a person. Those experiences hurt, but they also clarified something essential: my worth did not hinge on being understood correctly by everyone. Understanding is relational, partial, and often slow. Dignity, by contrast, is non-negotiable. I also confronted grief more directly, the grief of lost time, of paths not taken, of versions of myself that had been constrained by fear. It would have been easy to romanticize that grief, to frame it as tragedy. Instead, I tried to let it be instructive. Regret, when examined carefully, can sharpen empathy. It made me more patient with others who were navigating their own quiet reckonings, visible or not. As my internal life grew more integrated, the sense of transformation became less dramatic and more grounded. There were no sweeping revelations, no final arrival. Just accumulation, of self-trust, of emotional literacy, of resilience. I began to feel less like I was becoming someone new and more like I was inhabiting myself more fully. One evening, alone and unremarkable, I caught my reflection unexpectedly and realized that the question I had once asked obsessively, "Is this allowed?" had been replaced by a quieter one, "Is this honest?" That shift mattered. Permission seeks authority elsewhere. Honesty answers inwardly, then acts with consideration. I understood then that the most meaningful transformation had not been how I appeared, or even how others perceived me, but how I related to truth. I no longer treated it as something dangerous that needed careful containment. I treated it as something that required stewardship, handled thoughtfully, shared responsibly, and lived consistently. That understanding didn't make life easier in every way. But it made it coherent. And coherence, I was discovering, is a form of peace that doesn't depend on certainty, only on integrity. Time did what it always does when change stops demanding attention and starts asking for maintenance. The urgency softened. The conversations became less charged. The internal alarms that once flared at every unfamiliar situation learned to quiet themselves. What replaced them wasn't certainty, but familiarity, a sense that I knew how to move within my own life without constantly checking for permission. I began to recognize how much of my earlier fear had been rooted not in danger, but in anticipation. I had imagined judgment as an event rather than a possibility, something guaranteed rather than conditional. Living more openly, carefully, thoughtfully, but openly, taught me that most responses fall somewhere between indifference and effortful goodwill. The extremes exist, but they are rarer than the stories we tell ourselves when fear is doing the narrating. That realization didn't make me naive. I remained aware of risk, of power dynamics, of the ways institutions lag behind human complexity. But awareness stopped being paralyzing. It became contextual. I learned how to read situations more accurately, how to distinguish between discomfort and danger, between misunderstanding and malice. That discernment was hard-won, and it felt like a form of adulthood I hadn't fully entered before. I also noticed how my relationship with my past shifted. Memories that once felt like evidence against myself, moments of silence, deflection, self-denial, began to look different. I stopped judging them solely by what they lacked and started understanding them by what they protected. I hadn't been weak. I had been surviving with the tools I had at the time. That reframing didn't erase regret, but it softened it into something usable. My mother and I found a rhythm that didn't require constant explanation. There were still moments of learning, still questions that surfaced unexpectedly, but they no longer carried the same charge. We had established a foundation of mutual respect, imperfect, evolving, but real. One afternoon, without ceremony, she asked how I'd been feeling lately, not as a check-in about identity, but as a person. That mattered more than any statement of understanding ever could have. I began to think more deliberately about the kind of person I wanted to be beyond this particular axis of self-knowledge. Integrity, I realized, is not a single alignment but a pattern, how one tells the truth, how one listens, how one adapts without disappearing. The work I had done internally sharpened my sense of responsibility outward. I was more careful with words. More attentive to the impact of my presence. Less interested in being right than in being accountable. There were moments when I encountered people at earlier stages of their own questioning, uncertain, guarded, sometimes clumsy in their self-understanding. I resisted the urge to guide or correct unless invited. My story was not a solution. It was evidence that complexity could be lived with, not solved. Offering that quietly felt more ethical than prescribing a path. As years passed, the memory of that afternoon in the mall became less vivid in its details and more symbolic in its meaning. Not because it faded, but because it integrated. It stopped being the moment everything changed and became the moment everything began to be handled differently. I no longer replayed it to measure how far I'd come. I carried it as a reminder of what honesty costs and what it gives. What it gave me most consistently was coherence. My inner life and outer actions aligned closely enough that I no longer felt split. That alignment didn't eliminate conflict, but it made conflict navigable. I could disagree without unraveling. I could be misunderstood without collapsing. I could be seen without feeling consumed by the gaze. I also came to understand that transformation narratives often overemphasize arrival. They promise resolution, clarity, a stable endpoint where doubt dissolves permanently. My experience offered something quieter and more durable, the capacity to live with open questions without betraying myself. That capacity felt like wisdom, not because it answered everything, but because it made uncertainty survivable. Looking back, I see how easily my story could have been framed as transgression or revelation, as something dramatic or disruptive. But that framing misses what mattered most. What mattered was the ethical labor, the ongoing effort to live honestly while remaining attentive to others, to balance self-respect with empathy, to grow without demanding that growth be effortless for those around me. If there is anything I hope this memory offers beyond itself, it is the understanding that identity is not a spectacle and truth is not a performance. They are practices, shaped by context, carried through relationship, and refined over time. They require courage, yes, but also patience, humility, and care. The dressing room door, once so heavy with consequence, is now just a door in my memory. What lingers is not the fear I felt standing behind it, but the choice I made when it opened, to step forward without knowing exactly who would meet me there, and to trust that honesty, handled responsibly, could be stronger than hiding ever was. That trust did not make life simple. It made it real. And that, I have learned, is enough.